Stress affects us all, whether we're concerned about our finances, our career, our relationships in our life. We have a tendency to think about the negative aspects of what might happen to us in the future, and the consequence of this is that our stress levels start to rise and go up. What we'd like to do in this presentation is have a look at stress, just try and get an understanding of what causes it, why do we actually feel stressed on some occasions, and maybe some techniques that could help us alleviate or at least reduce the effects of stress on our lives. Many people suffer from stress, and it's true to say that it appears that some people seem to have more difficulties with stress than others. So we'd like to understand in this presentation what can we do about trying to reduce stress and its effects. The definition in the dictionary of stress is it's a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. The fact is, we can feel stress in our lives even if there doesn't appear to be any adverse or demanding circumstances surrounding us. Just ordinary day to day events can often cause us to feel that adrenaline rushing through our system or increased heartbeat and the other symptoms that we often associate with increased levels of stress. There's certainly some types of stress that are very hard to avoid. If we are denied in any way our basic human needs, or we're experiencing significant pain, or we have to go through the trauma of losing a loved one, these stresses are going to come to us, but they do tend to be temporary and they do tend to alleviate after a period of time. One of the biggest causes of stress in people's lives on a day to day basis outside of these external events are ourselves. It's stated that 10% of stress is caused by what happens to us, and 90% is caused by how we react to it. If we want to refer to this as ordinary everyday stress, then there's a message in this that there's something that we can do about it because it's within our own making that we cause the stress, and therefore maybe there's something we can do to reduce the stress as well. If we look at different types of stress in everyday life, we could associate most of our feelings of stress generally with either fear or anger. And if we look at fear in particular, it stems from many different basic forms. From the Psychology Today website, they outline 5 different core forms of fear. The first one, which is quite extreme, is the fear of dying, ceasing to exist. The next one is mutilation, where our fear is that we lose parts of our body or we're invaded and we're going to be made sick by bugs or snakes or spiders or whatever it is that causes us to feel that level of fear. Another form of fear is loss of autonomy. If in any way we become immobilized, paralyzed, or restricted in some way, there's a great fear that we won't be able to look after ourselves and we'll have to rely on others. The fear of separation is the idea that we'll be cut off from the rest of the people that we associate with, that we become in some way ostracized and we're not valued or respected anymore. And the very traumatically sounding ego death is the fear of humiliation or shame. The idea that when we're communicating and interacting with others, that how they perceive us, how they look upon what we do and how we behave may be seen as being very negative, and we have a great fear that people will react to us in this particular way. So, with all those negative aspects of fear, and indeed when we consider the other aspects of anger as a key contributor to stress, then the question is, what can we do about it? What are the techniques, tools, if you like, that are available to us that can help reduce this level of stress and anxiety in our lives? There's been a lot of references in recent years to what's called mindfulness, which relates to different types of meditation. And very often, when people hear about meditation, they tend to withdraw. They tend to have a preconceived idea that meditation and meditative practices are carried out by people who they associate with New World cults or mystic organizations. In actual fact, there's been a lot of research carried out in recent years which shows that techniques like mindfulness meditation can have a very significant impact on reducing our stress levels on a day-to-day basis. So what we want to do now is have a look at why we actually feel stress. Is there actually something beneficial in it? What is it in our makeup that is necessary to have stress? Is it a good thing, in fact? If we consider stress from an evolutionary perspective, in other words, what is it in the evolution of the human species that has actually maintained this attribute that we have to get stressed and to get anxious or even to get very angry in certain circumstances? It's estimated that life began about 3.8 billion years ago, so there's been a very long time for life to evolve on the planet. And the basic principle of evolution is that as each generation develops, they tend to have mutations, differences from the previous generation. And sometimes these differences can be beneficial to them to the extent that it can help the species survive and pass the genes on to the next generation. But on some occasions, the mutations can be detrimental and actually can cause the extinction of species if they're not able to survive in their environment. Even if you take a creationist viewpoint, if you believe that we are made the way we are through some higher power that has designed us, the outcome of our behaviors and our feelings are still the same. How we got there is another question. But if we return to the idea of what is it that has actually benefited the human species from being stressed and being fearful, there's some answers that we can glean from the evolutionary development of human beings. So undoubtedly, many, many thousands of years ago, our ancestors lived in communities that had to fend for themselves, often in the wild, and there were many dangers that presented themselves. There were wild animals, and maybe there were other tribes that posed a danger on a regular basis. So if early man was confronted with an immediate danger, if he didn't have this ability to be suddenly fearful and kick in what is called the fight or flight response, where the stress hormones cause his body to react very quickly to the situation. If he was too relaxed about danger being presented, then there's a fair chance that he may not have survived. However, with this characteristic of an immediate stress response, where his muscles can be filled with oxygen to enable him to run away from danger or to fight it off, then there was a better chance that he was able to pass on his genes to the next generation. So, in that regard, fear can be seen in evolutionary terms as a benefit to the human race. It was there to help us get away quickly from danger without having to go through a rational process of trying to determine whether the danger was real or not. And even today, we have to recognize that from time to time we may be confronted with circumstances where, as we walk down the sidewalk and step onto the road, we suddenly see a car coming towards us, and without having to think about it, we jump back to avoid the danger. So, in that regards, The fear response and the stress response can actually keep us alive. But fact is, in many ordinary day-to-day situations, it's not very beneficial at all. If we have a quick look at what actually causes these stressful feelings within our body, it tends to come back to the brain. And in particular, there are particular glands in the brain referred to as the amygdala, so called because they're almond shaped, and amygdala is a Greek word for almond. And it's this little cluster of cells that has been known as the emotional seat of the brain. It's the triggering mechanism that makes us feel anxiety and fear and anger. So, under normal circumstances where we're not at all stressed, it's very often the case that we have to rationalize and solve problems. And the cerebral cortex, the front part of our brain, is where we tend to do this rational thinking and problem solving. We're not under any great stress, but we're trying to figure out how we're going to do things in the future. We're planning, we're trying to solve problems. But there's another part of the brain, often referred to as the reptilian brain, which it's said has been there from our evolutionary past, which contains this trigger mechanism to make us feel suddenly very stressed through the triggers of the amygdala. Sometimes we refer to this response as being an amygdala hijack. And this is where the messages get sent from the amygdala straight to the adrenal glands and release hormones into the system like adrenaline and cortisol, which has the familiar effects of an increased heartbeat, slowing down of our thought process sometimes, shallow breathing, sweaty palms. And it's this stress response that can often kick in at the most inappropriate times. And in fact, going back to the list of fears, the fear of being humiliated is often one of those responses where we get just at the wrong moment these feelings of stress. If we're confronted with communicating with someone, interacting with someone, be it a presentation at work or hosting a meeting or having to deal with a difficult conversation, very often we feel overcome by these usual stress symptoms that curtail us in some way from thinking straight and cause those effects that we really don't want at that point in time. So the question is there anything we can do about it? Can we actually use tools or mechanisms that could reduce this trigger mechanism? So we talk about fear, we've mentioned anger, and very often as soon as we are triggered in a stressful situation, our behaviors either go down the route of fear or they can become quite angry. Anger is something that potentially we can have control of very quickly if we just discipline ourselves to push the pause button. Don't overreact quickly, but very often before we realize it, we've said or done something that we regret. And then ultimately, if stress is an ongoing, continuous thing in our lives, we tend to become more anxious and even feel a bit sad or depressed. And these negative feelings really inhibit how we live our life to the full. And it has a bearing on many aspects of our lives, be it relationships, our mental health, our physical health, or even on our career. There's been a lot of research done recently that shows direct connections between our stress levels and our physical health, especially things like heart disease, which have shown to be increased by people who exhibit higher levels of stress in their lives. So the good news is the fight or flight or fight, flight and freeze response is something that we can manage. That idea that 90% of our stress is caused by ourselves suggests that maybe there's something we can do about it rather than continually looking elsewhere, because we do tend to have a tendency to think about the next thing that's going to happen, that's going to make us happy, that's going to make us less stressed. If we get that job, we'll feel better. If we move house, we'll be happier. If we get that new car, we'll be more content. And we do very often find ourselves thinking about what might happen in the future, be it positive or negative, rather than just taking the time to live in the present. And that indeed is the essence of mindfulness or mindfulness meditation, is the idea that we shouldn't be continually ruminating and thinking negatively about what might happen in the future, because this continual thinking about what could happen to us that could be negative just increases the sensitivity with which our stress response can get activated. The more we think about negative thoughts, the more it feels normal to our brain, and the more likely it is that this response is going to kick in. So, a very simple fact is trying to do the opposite, namely to find a space where we're not thinking about anything. We're trying to make our mind feel relaxed and calm, and reducing the stresses within our whole system. This has the effect of generally reducing our stress going forward. If we're able just to find that space to pull back from all those negativities and all those stressful thoughts. So, stress is very much a natural part of what we are. Everybody at some stage or another experiences fear, anxiety, even panic. But there are very well understood physiological processes from the brain throughout our whole bodily system that triggers these responses. And it has been shown that dwelling on negativity and continually thinking about what could go wrong sensitizes these responses within our system. But the other side of that is through tools like meditation, finding ways to relax, even things like taking regular exercise, making sure that we're maintaining good relationships with people, doing things that take us away from ruminating about events in the future that may never happen, are all good tools to try and reduce our stress levels. This presentation has just been a taster for some of the processes within our brain that causes stress, and likewise some suggestions as to how we can maybe help reduce or alleviate that stress. So it might be a good idea to do a little bit of research yourself, find out more about these techniques, and certainly if stress is becoming more of a problem to you in your daily life, find someone to talk to, find a way to alleviate it, because it doesn't have to be there.